8 men, 3 nights of infiltration, 1 target buried deep behind Russian lines, and a strike so precise it restored Ukrainian drone operations across 60 kilometers of front line. This is how Ukraine's GUR military intelligence sent a reconnaissance sabotage team into occupied Luhansk Oblast, guided HIMARS rockets and FPV drones onto a Russian electronic warfare complex, and walked every single operator home alive. I'm your host at UkraineSignal, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this operation, carried out in late January 2026, is one of the most tactically significant Special Forces missions of the entire conflict. Not because of the size of the force, not because of the scale of the explosion, but because of what it unlocked. When that Russian EW complex went dark, Ukrainian drone units across the Svatove-Kreminna axis suddenly regained 70% of their operational range. Dozens of FPV teams that had been grounded or severely limited were back in the fight within 48 hours. The ripple effect was enormous. Let's break down exactly how it happened. To understand why this mission mattered, you need to understand what was happening on the ground in January 2026. The Svatove-Kreminna axis had become one of the most contested sectors on the entire front. Russian forces had been pushing hard since late autumn, throwing wave after wave of infantry and armor at Ukrainian defensive lines stretched across the forests and ridgelines between these two cities. The fighting was brutal, daily, relentless. But something had changed in early January. Ukrainian drone operators began reporting catastrophic interference. FPV drones that normally operated reliably at ranges of 8 to 12 kilometers were losing signal at 3, sometimes 2. Reconnaissance drones flying pre-planned routes were crashing without explanation. Mavic series quadcopters used for artillery correction were going haywire mid-flight, spinning in circles before plummeting into the tree line. The pattern was unmistakable. Russia had deployed something new, something powerful, and it was strangling Ukrainian drone capability across the entire sector. UkraineSignal's intelligence teams began triangulating the source. Every time a drone lost contact, they logged the location, the altitude, the frequency band affected. Over 2 weeks, the data painted a clear picture. The interference was emanating from a single point approximately 14 kilometers behind the Russian front line, near a former collective farm compound southwest of Svatove. Satellite imagery confirmed what the signal's analysts suspected. The compound had been heavily modified. New antenna arrays were visible. Vehicle tracks showed regular logistics traffic. Camouflage netting covered multiple large platforms, and the thermal signatures were consistent, with high-power electronic warfare systems drawing significant generator output. Ukrainian intelligence assessed the site, housed at least one Krasukha-4 broadband jamming system capable of disrupting radar and satellite communications across a wide area, and at least one Pole-21 navigation warfare system designed to spoof and jam GPS signals that many Ukrainian drones relied on for navigation. Together, these systems created an electronic denial zone that was crippling Ukrainian operations. Which weapon would have been most effective against this target on its own? A. HIMARS precision rockets. B. Long-range FPV drones. C. A combination strike using both. Think about it. We'll reveal the answer at the end. The problem was targeting. HIMARS rockets are devastatingly accurate, but only when fed precise coordinates. Satellite imagery could confirm the compound existed, but the Russians had positioned the actual EW systems under camouflage netting and moved them between prepared positions within the compound. A strike based solely on satellite data risked hitting empty revetments while the actual equipment sat untouched 50 meters away. Ukraine needed eyes on the ground. Real-time human intelligence that could pinpoint exactly where the Krasukha-4 and Pole-21 systems were positioned at the moment of the strike. That meant sending operators behind enemy lines. The GUR's Shaman battalion got the call. The Shaman battalion is one of Ukraine's most experienced special operations units operating under military intelligence. Their operators specialize in long-range reconnaissance and sabotage missions deep in Russian-occupied territory. These are men who have spent months training for exactly this kind of operation: small team insertion, extended survival behind enemy lines, precision target designation under extreme risk. 8 operators were selected. The team composition was deliberate. 2 communications specialists carrying encrypted burst transmission equipment, 2 designated marksmen providing security, one electronic warfare specialist who could identify and confirm the Russian systems visually, one combat medic, and 2 team leaders, including a senior captain who had conducted 3 previous missions behind Russian lines since 2024. Their infiltration route was planned over 6 days using a combination of satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and information from partisan contacts in occupied territory. The route avoided all known Russian checkpoint positions. It threaded through gaps in surveillance coverage that Ukrainian electronic intelligence had identified by monitoring Russian radar and sensor emissions. Every step was calculated. They crossed the line of contact on the night of January 21, 2026. The first obstacle was the mined no-man's land between the 2 front lines. This strip of terrain, ranging from 400 meters to nearly 2 kilometers wide, depending on the sector, was saturated with anti-personnel mines, TM-62 anti-tank mines, PMN-2 blast mines, tripwired fragmentation devices. The density was staggering. Ukrainian combat engineers had mapped partial lanes through sections of the minefield using drone surveillance, but no lane was guaranteed safe. The team moved in single file. Point man using a handheld mine detector, advancing at a pace of roughly 100 meters per hour. Behind him, each operator stepped precisely in the footprints of the man ahead. One misstep meant death or catastrophic injury, and a catastrophic injury behind enemy lines, kilometers from any medical evacuation, was effectively a death sentence. It took them 4 hours to cross the minefield. 4 hours of absolute silence, absolute concentration, absolute discipline. They emerged on the Russian side at approximately 2:40 a.m., soaked in sweat despite the January cold. The next challenge was the Russian checkpoint lines. Svatove sits at the intersection of several major roads, and the Russians had established 2 concentric rings of checkpoints and observation posts around their rear area. The outer ring consisted of vehicle checkpoints on roads and tracks. The inner ring was tighter, with dismounted patrols and observation positions covering likely approach routes. The Shaman team bypassed both rings by moving through terrain the Russians considered impassable: flooded agricultural drainage ditches, dense forest undergrowth, a frozen marshland that the team crossed by distributing their weight on improvised snowshoes made from branches and paracord. They moved only at night, lying up during daylight hours in pre-selected hide positions identified from satellite imagery. Stay with me, because what happens over the next 72 hours ends with secondary explosions visible from 15 kilometers away. The thermal masking cloaks the team carried were critical. These lightweight, multi-layered garments incorporated metallic mesh that dramatically reduced the operator's infrared signatures. Russian observation posts equipped with thermal imaging devices scanned the terrain regularly. Without the cloaks, 8 body heat signatures moving through frozen landscape would have been visible at ranges exceeding 1 kilometer. With them, the team's thermal profile was reduced to near ambient levels, making them virtually invisible to anything but the closest visual observation. On the second night, January 22nd, the team covered approximately 6 kilometers through dense forest east of their target. Movement was agonizingly slow. Every footstep had to be placed silently on frozen ground that wanted to crunch and snap with each step. The temperature dropped to -11 degrees Celsius. The operators could not use any heating elements, could not light any flame, could not even risk the thermal signature of breath condensation in open areas, pressing scarves and balaclavas tight against their faces when crossing clearings. At one point, the team froze in position for 47 minutes while a Russian dismounted patrol passed within 90 meters of their location. The patrol consisted of 6 soldiers moving carelessly, talking audibly, flashlights occasionally sweeping the tree line. The Shaman operators lay motionless in shallow depressions, weapons ready, but safety's on. Engagement was the absolute last resort. Any firefight would compromise the entire mission and likely result in the team being hunted by vastly superior numbers. The patrol passed without incident. The Russians never knew how close they came. By the third night, January 23rd, the team had reached a position approximately 2 kilometers from the target compound. The electronic warfare specialist began detecting strong emissions consistent with the Krasukha-4's broadband jamming signature. They were close. The final approach required crossing an open agricultural field approximately 800 meters wide. No cover. No concealment, except darkness and the thermal cloaks. The team crossed in 2 groups of 4, staggered by 15 minutes, low-crawling the final 300 meters, where the terrain rose slightly and silhouetted against the ambient light on the horizon. At 1:15 a.m. on January 24th, the team established their observation post in a partially collapsed drainage culvert, 1.4 kilometers from the compound's outer perimeter. From this position, using high-powered night vision optics and a laser rangefinder, they had direct line of sight to the compound. What they saw confirmed every intelligence assessment and added critical details that no satellite could provide. The compound occupied roughly 3 hectares of a former collective farm. The original buildings, concrete livestock barns, and a brick administrative structure had been repurposed as barracks and command facilities. Vehicle tracks were everywhere, churned into frozen mud. 2 large antenna arrays were clearly visible, even partially concealed under camouflage netting. The electronic warfare specialist identified the distinctive cross-shaped antenna configuration of the Krasukha-4 system, mounted on its BAZ-69108 wheeled chassis. Nearby, a smaller vehicle carried the Pole-21 system's jamming array. But the most valuable intelligence was the security disposition. The compound was defended by what the team assessed as a reinforced company, approximately 120 to 140 soldiers. Sandbagged fighting positions ringed the perimeter. 2 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles were parked in revetments near the main gate. A Zu-23-2 twin-barreled anti-aircraft gun was positioned on the roof of the administrative building, likely intended as defense against drone attack. Regular patrols circled the compound at intervals the team began timing immediately. The team's communications specialist prepared the burst transmission. In modern electronic warfare environments, any radio emission is a death sentence if it lasts too long. Russian signals intelligence units constantly scan for unauthorized transmissions. The burst system compressed the team's encoded message into a transmission lasting less than 0.3 of a second. At that duration, even sophisticated Russian intercept equipment would struggle to detect, locate, and classify the signal before it vanished. At 2:08 a.m., the first burst went out. GPS coordinates of the Krasukha-4 system, precise to within 2 meters, bearing and distance from identifiable terrain features as backup, assessment of camouflage netting configuration, location of the Pole-21 system, positions of the BMP-2 fighting vehicles, location of the Zu-23-2 anti-aircraft position. 90 seconds later, a confirmation burst came back. 2 words, encoded. Package confirmed. The strike was authorized. Subscribe to UkraineSignal if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because operations like this one are rewriting the textbooks in real time. 40 kilometers to the west, behind Ukrainian lines, a HIMARS battery received the fire mission. The M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system is one of the most consequential weapons in this war. Mounted on a 5-ton truck chassis, it carries a pod of 6 M31 GMLRS guided rockets, each carrying a 200-pound fragmentation warhead with GPS and inertial guidance that delivers accuracy within 2 meters of the program target point. Range, up to 92 kilometers. Time of flight to this target at approximately 45 kilometers, roughly 60 seconds. 2 HIMARS launchers were tasked. Each would fire 3 rockets in rapid succession, 6 rockets total. 6 GPS-guided munitions converging on the compound within a window of approximately 12 seconds. Simultaneously, 30 kilometers behind the front line, a Ukrainian FPV drone relay team prepared 15 long-range first-person view drones. These were not standard commercial quadcopters. These were purpose-built strike platforms with extended range achieved through a signal relay system. A larger drone flying at altitude acted as a communications bridge, extending the control link of the smaller FPV strike drones far beyond their normal operational radius. Each FPV carried a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating light armored vehicles or destroying antenna systems and communications equipment. The coordination required was extraordinary. The HIMARS rockets would arrive first, targeting the Krasukha-4 and Pole-21 positions with devastating high-explosive fragmentation warheads. The FPV wave would arrive seconds to minutes later, targeting any surviving equipment, command vehicles, and the security force positions that would be in chaos from the initial impacts. Timing was everything. Launch too early and the Russians might detect the incoming rockets and attempt to relocate the EW systems. Launch too late and the element of surprise, bought with 3 nights of infiltration by 8 men who were still lying in a drainage culvert 1.4 kilometers away, would be wasted. At 3:47 a.m. on January 24, 2026, both HIMARS launchers fired. The Shaman team heard nothing at first. The rockets were 45 kilometers out and climbing through their ballistic arc. The operators kept their optics trained on the compound, waiting. The communications specialists silently counted seconds. If you believe tactics win wars, not just numbers, type UkraineSignal in the comments. 58 seconds after launch, the first rocket arrived. The impact was catastrophic. The M31 warhead detonated directly on top of the Krasukha-4 system's primary antenna array. The shaped fragmentation warhead sent thousands of tungsten fragments ripping through the delicate electronic components, the hydraulic positioning system, and the BAZ-6910 chassis. The vehicle erupted in a fireball as diesel fuel ignited. The antenna array, a sophisticated piece of equipment worth millions of dollars and months of production time, was shredded into unrecognizable wreckage. 2 seconds later, the second rocket struck, then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. The impacts walked across the compound in a pattern designed to maximize destruction. 2 rockets targeted the Krasukha-4 position. 2 targeted the Pole-21 system 30 meters to its east. 2 targeted the administrative building and the adjacent vehicle park where command vehicles had been identified. Through their optics, the Shaman team watched the compound disappear in a rolling cascade of explosions. Debris flew hundreds of meters into the air. A massive secondary explosion, far larger than the rocket warheads alone could produce, erupted from the vehicle park area. The team assessed this was stored fuel or ammunition detonating. The fireball climbed over 100 meters, illuminating the surrounding terrain like daylight. Then, the FPV drones arrived. 15 drones, guided by operators sitting in a concealed position 30 kilometers away, swarmed toward the burning compound. Their cameras showed a scene of devastation. The Krasukha-4 position was a crater of burning wreckage. The Pole-21 system had been thrown off its vehicle chassis and lay broken in a field adjacent to the compound. The administrative building had partially collapsed, but there were still targets. A command vehicle, a modified KAMAZ truck with communications antennae, was attempting to drive out of the compound through a rear gate. The first FPV dove on it at over 160 kilometers per hour. The shaped charge warhead punched through the vehicle's roof. It slewed sideways and stopped, smoke pouring from every opening. A second FPV struck a generator trailer that was still running, powering equipment that no longer existed. The explosion severed power cables and sent sparks cascading across the compound. 3 more FPVs targeted the sandbagged fighting positions where Russian soldiers were attempting to organize a response. In the chaos and darkness, with fires burning everywhere and ammunition cooking off, the defenders had no idea what was happening. They were firing wildly into the sky, trying to hit drones they couldn't see against the smoke-filled darkness. The remaining drones systematically struck vehicles, antenna masts, and any structure showing signs of activity. One drone operator identified what appeared to be a second command vehicle hidden under a camouflage net near the livestock barn. The FPV threaded through a gap in the netting and detonated against the vehicle's communications array. That vehicle would never transmit again. Within 8 minutes of the first HIMARS impact, the compound that had housed Russia's most significant electronic warfare capability on the Svatove-Kreminna axis was a burning ruin. Primary and secondary explosions continued for over 20 minutes as fuel, ammunition, and stored equipment detonated in the intense heat. The Shaman team observed it all from their culvert, recording everything on helmet-mounted cameras. The senior captain noted the time of each major explosion, cataloging destruction for the after-action report. When the secondary explosions began subsiding, he transmitted one final burst message. Target destroyed, requesting extraction protocol. But the mission was only half over. 8 men still had to get home. The exfiltration plan had been prepared with the same meticulous detail as the infiltration. The team could not retrace their steps. The massive explosions had awakened every Russian unit within 20 kilometers. Vehicle headlights were already visible on roads converging toward the burning compound. Helicopter rotors could be heard in the distance. The Russians would be hunting for whoever had directed this strike. The team moved immediately, abandoning their observation post and heading northwest toward the Oskil River, 11 kilometers away. Their route had been selected to avoid roads and known Russian positions, threading through forests and crossing agricultural land where frozen stubble provided minimal concealment. Ukrainian artillery supported the exfiltration. A battery of 155mm howitzers began firing a carefully planned smokescreen along a 3-kilometer front adjacent to the team's route. The smoke rounds created a dense white curtain that obscured visual observation and degraded thermal imaging. Under this artificial fog, the team moved at their maximum sustainable pace. What would NATO doctrine have recommended differently for this exfiltration? A helicopter extraction? A larger security force? Comment your analysis below. They covered the 11 kilometers in just over 4 hours. The pace was punishing, roughly 3 kilometers per hour through broken terrain in darkness, carrying weapons, communications equipment, and recording devices. The combat medic treated 2 operators for minor injuries sustained during the rapid movement, a twisted ankle from a frozen irrigation ditch, and a laceration from barbed wire fencing around an abandoned farmstead. At 8:22 a.m. on January 24th, with dawn beginning to lighten the eastern horizon, the team reached the Oskil River. The river at this point was approximately 40 meters wide and partially frozen. Ice along the edges was too thin to support a crossing on foot, but thick enough to impede swimming. The water temperature was near 0 degrees Celsius. A Ukrainian riverine unit was waiting on the western bank. 2 rigid-hull inflatable boats with suppressed outboard motors. The boats had been pre-positioned overnight, their crews waiting in concealed positions under camouflage netting on the Ukrainian-controlled shore. The crossing took 7 minutes, 2 trips, 4 operators per boat. The boats cut through the thin marginal ice and crossed the open water at maximum speed. Russian positions on the eastern bank were over 3 kilometers away at this point, and the morning fog rising off the river provided additional concealment. At 8:29 a.m., all 8 operators of the Shaman team were on the Ukrainian-controlled western bank of the Oskil River. All 8 men returned without casualties, every one of them. The battle damage assessment began immediately and continued for days. Satellite imagery taken on January 25th showed the compound completely destroyed. The Krasukha-4 position was identifiable only as a blackened crater with scattered debris. The Pole-21 vehicle had been reduced to a burned-out shell. At least 4 other vehicles were destroyed, including 2 confirmed command and communications vehicles. The administrative building was partially collapsed, and the vehicle park was a field of charred wreckage. UkraineSignal's intelligence confirmed what the satellite imagery suggested. The electronic interference that had been crippling drone operations across the sector vanished within hours of the strike. The broadband jamming ceased entirely. GPS spoofing stopped. Drone operators who had been operating at severely reduced ranges reported an immediate and dramatic improvement. Within 48 hours, Ukrainian drone units across the Svatove-Kreminna axis reported a 70% increase in operational drone range. FPV teams that had been limited to 2 to 3 kilometer effective ranges were suddenly operating at 8, 10, 12 kilometers again. Reconnaissance drones could fly their full pre-planned routes without interference. Artillery correction drones were back to full effectiveness. The operational impact was immediate and measurable. Ukrainian forces on the Axis conducted over 40 successful FPV strikes in the first 72 hours after the EW complex was destroyed, compared to fewer than a dozen in the 72 hours before. Russian infantry and armor movements that had been conducted with relative impunity under the EW umbrella were suddenly exposed to the full lethality of Ukraine's drone fleet. Russian forces attempted to compensate. Intercepted communications revealed frantic requests to higher command for replacement EW systems. A Krasukha-4 system is not something that can be replaced overnight. These are complex, expensive systems produced in limited numbers. Ukrainian intelligence assessed that the Russians would need at least 4 to 6 weeks to deploy a replacement system to the sector, and any replacement would likely be targeted using the same tactics. The GUR published redacted helmet cam footage from the operation approximately 2 weeks later. The footage, carefully edited to remove anything that could reveal specific tactics, equipment details, or operator identities, showed the final minutes before the strike from the observation post position. The grainy green imagery of night vision footage captured the compound in eerie stillness, vehicles and antenna arrays barely distinguishable under their camouflage netting. Then, the first HIMARS rocket arrived. The footage captured the searing white flash of impact, the rolling fireball of secondary explosions, and the systematic destruction wrought by the follow-on FPV strikes. The audio captured the operators' controlled professional communications as they cataloged each impact. The footage went viral. Millions of views across social media platforms within days. Not because of the explosions, though they were spectacular, but because of what the footage represented. 8 men operating deep behind enemy lines for 3 days in freezing temperatures, through minefields and past enemy patrols to guide a strike that restored Ukrainian combat capability across an entire front sector. This is what makes the Ukrainian military extraordinary. Not just courage, though that was present in abundance. Not just technology, though the combination of HIMARS precision rockets and long-range FPV drones was devastatingly effective. But the integration of human intelligence, signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, precision strike, and drone warfare into a single coordinated operation executed flawlessly under extreme pressure. Russia spent millions of dollars deploying an electronic warfare complex designed to blind Ukrainian forces across 60 kilometers of front line. Ukraine neutralized it with 8 men, 6 rockets, and 15 drones. The cost asymmetry is staggering. The Krasukha-4 system alone is estimated to cost between 100 and 200 million rubles. The Pole-21 system adds tens of millions more. The command vehicles, generators, support equipment, ammunition, and personnel losses push the total destruction value into the hundreds of millions of rubles. Ukraine's expenditure, 6 GMLRS rockets at roughly $160,000 each, 15 FPV drones at perhaps $500 to $1,000 each, and the operational cost of the Shaman team's insertion and extraction. Less than $1 million in strike assets destroyed a complex worth many times that amount. And the strategic value of restoring Ukrainian drone operations across an entire axis was incalculable. Now, the answer to our earlier question. Which weapon would have been most effective against this target on its own? The answer is C, the combination strike. HIMARS alone could have destroyed the compound, but without real-time ground intelligence, the rockets might have hit empty positions while the actual EW system sat untouched under camouflage netting 30 meters away. FPV drones alone lack the payload to ensure destruction of hardened military vehicles in a single coordinated blow, and would have given the Russians time to relocate between individual strikes. It was the combination. Ground operators providing precise coordinates for HIMARS to deliver the initial devastating blow, followed immediately by FPV drones to destroy survivors and escapees, that made this operation so effective. Combined arms warfare adapted for the 21st century. This operation teaches several critical lessons. First, electronic warfare has become a decisive factor on the modern battlefield. Russia's deployment of the Krasukha-4 and Pole-21 complex effectively degraded Ukrainian combat capability across an entire front sector. The ability to deny an opponent the use of their drone fleet is strategically significant in a war where drones have become the primary reconnaissance and precision strike tool for both sides. Second, no electronic warfare system is invulnerable. The very emissions that make these systems effective also make them detectable. Ukrainian signals intelligence was able to locate the complex by analyzing the interference patterns it created. The systems that jammed Ukrainian drones also served as a beacon advertising their own position to anyone with the right sensors and the analytical capability to interpret the data. Third, human intelligence remains irreplaceable. Satellites can find a compound. Signals intelligence can identify what is in it. But only trained operators on the ground, close enough to see through camouflage netting and identify specific vehicle types by their antenna configurations, can provide the targeting precision needed for a decisive strike. The 8 Shaman operators provided what no satellite or drone could: real-time, confirmed, precise coordinates of mobile military systems that had been deliberately concealed. Fourth, combined arms integration is the defining characteristic of effective modern warfare. This single operation integrated special forces infiltration, signals intelligence analysis, satellite reconnaissance, HIMARS precision rocket artillery, long-range FPV drone strikes, conventional artillery smokescreen support, and riverine extraction forces. Each element was essential. Remove anyone, and the operation either fails entirely or achieves significantly reduced results. Fifth, this operation demonstrates why Ukraine continues to contest the most heavily defended sectors of the front, not through brute force, which Russia possesses in greater quantity, but through intelligence, precision, innovation, and the extraordinary courage of operators willing to spend 3 nights behind enemy lines in freezing temperatures to guide a strike onto a target that algorithms and satellites could only approximate. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineSignal. 3 questions to consider. Was the decision to insert a ground team worth the risk, given that a miss with HIMARS alone would have simply meant firing another volley? Could Russia have protected the EW complex more effectively, perhaps by dispersing the systems across multiple smaller sites rather than concentrating them in a single compound? And what would you have done differently if you were planning the exfiltration, knowing that the strike itself would alert every Russian unit within 20 kilometers to the presence of a forward observer? Subscribe to UkraineSignal, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The collective farm compound southwest of Svatove is quiet now. The fires burned out days ago. What remains is a field of twisted metal and scorched concrete, craters where antenna arrays once stood, and the burned hulks of vehicles that will never transmit another signal. Russian work crews have already begun clearing the wreckage, hauling away the remnants of a system that was supposed to blind Ukrainian forces for months. It lasted less than 3 weeks. Somewhere on the Ukrainian side of the Oskol River, 8 men returned to their unit, debriefed, slept, and began preparing for the next mission. Their names remain classified. Their faces were blurred in the released footage, but their work speaks for itself in the restored hum of Ukrainian drones filling the skies over Svatove and Kreminna once again. Modern warfare punishes overconfidence without mercy. Stay vigilant.